ComBank Summit, Forward Together 2025, creating a sustainable future.
Thank you very much. And a massive thank you to Commercial Bank for having us, having this panel. I think it's particularly interesting that in a world today where the words diversity, inclusion, equity, worse, gender have not just become, kind of concepts to be frightened and concepts that we are pushing back against, but in a time when in some places it's actively being disintegrated, it's actively being, the fragile gains that have been made actively being reversed. It's incredibly heartening to see companies in Sri Lanka, to see corporate sector in Sri Lanka and multi-stakeholders see this as an opportunity to push forward rather than to stagnate and move backwards. So I'm very excited for this panel of allies, friends, troublemakers, in the best way, who will not only talk about how inclusive climate finance and intersectionality and inclusion becomes a reality, but really focus on what it means for corporates to take those actions, and what it means when they can and how they take those actions. I want to pick up on a couple of things, Amanti, that you said in your keynote. And one of the things you talked about was, or the examples you used were of very diverse communities. Communities that have disabilities or live with disabilities, indigenous communities, rural communities, communities living below the poverty line. And this is particularly important when we think about inclusion, because it's very easy for us to silo populations. It's very easy for us to say, this is what people with disabilities need, this is what people who live in rural economies need, this is what women need. But what happens when you're a woman with a disability living below the poverty line in a rural setting? What happens then? Where do you fall into in these brackets? And this is something that's incredibly important when we talk about inclusion, is being inclusive is not putting people into boxes, it's about dispensing with the boxes altogether. And that's some of what we want to touch on, along with this idea of co-designing solutions, which I love, because what happens when you actually radical idea, talk to the people who have to actually live with the solutions that you're creating. And so this is really where we want to focus the session on. The key I want to start with, and I'm going to open with you, Selena, is really talking about businesses creating inclusive business models, right? Because what happens when businesses start thinking about the models itself that they are creating? And how does that look at addressing climate challenges from the core of the business model itself?
Yeah. Thank you, Sharanya. And I'm going to start off by saying something controversial in this room, at least, that CSR is not sustainable. I think it's about time that we move away from that terminology, because what we really need to be looking at is exactly what Sharanya pointed as, how do we move businesses, operation models, financial decisions we take, procurement decisions we take, into a mission, having mission and purpose at the core, and how do we move beyond CSR? I think that is really the discussion that we need to have, and I think as Sri Lanka, we can, because we've done CSR quite well. So how do we take that step as a private sector? So that's where I want to start. And Celine, we are a 35-year-old company. We are based in Kurunegala, founded by my mother. And we are known globally as an organization that is, has, to say it very simply, cracked the code on the mindset required to create this purpose-driven organizations. I think in a nutshell, that's what we have done. Yes, we produce handloom, yes, we do various other things, but really as a business model, that's what we have done. So there's always a philosophy and a vision when you you create these models, and our philosophy is simply people, planet, profit partnerships. Yes, it's a very quirky kind of cliche thing to say, but really as business women, business leaders, CEOs, how do you take those business decisions, giving priority to each of these verticals? That is not an easy task, especially not when you have crisis, global crisis, economic crisis in Sri Lanka, political instabilities, shareholders. Not an easy thing to do, and I empathize with that, right? And that is where I think we need to be open about the fact that it's not easy, and then dig into what it means to create those models. So maybe to just keep it short and also provide some solutions and takeaways from what I have to say. So Celine as a whole, what we've done is that we've created this model where we target specifically women who are unable to engage in the formal sector of the economy. So we do everything from recruitment policies to the way that they work, the way our product development is done, from production lines to when salaries are given, when our outsource, when payments are made to our suppliers. Everything is looked at in those verticals. How do you create that impact so that women can come to work and stay at work? So that is essentially what we do as an organization. And so I think the question that you guys are probably thinking is, yeah, easy to do. They do handlooms, right? Medium scale enterprises, no massive shareholders breathing down their necks. So, but I think there are some learnings here, right? So what does it really take to do this? And for us and for me as also a development practitioner before I came into the private sector, it's, I think, primarily about reframing the question, asking the question in a different way, defining outcomes in a different way, and really defining KPIs in a different way. Because if I take an example, like, I know this is not particularly on climate, but if you take recruitment, one of the easy ones that we all have to deal with, you know, it's always spoken about women should be, there's, you know, only 30-odd% of women in the formal economy. No matter how many advertisements we put, where we put it, we are not getting women to work. But if you have an 8-to-5 working environment without flexibility, how does a woman come to work? That's what I mean when I say we reframe those KPIs. We reframe the basis on which we are taking decisions, right? And I think I also need to say a key takeaway for us is that what we do is not necessarily just in HR and ESG. It is across from procurement, from finance to operations to our production lines. It's that entirety kind of like entire approach that we take, and it moving really from compliance to community. And I think that's where Sharanya, we will talk about later how we really listen to communities in the way that we work, right? And maybe some of the, since we are in a conference organized by a bank, I need to say this, because when we talk about, for instance, the climate and all the green financing that is available for businesses, the sustainable financing and the complaint that we hear all the time, no projects, we have funds, but we don't have projects. But do these projects go beyond looking at innovation? Do they take into account failure? Because until you do that, you're not going to be able to really find the projects that are a solution to the problems that we are having this conference to talk about, right? And another example, when we talk about impact, especially private sector, we want numbers, we want projects, but are we investing in quality? Again, reframing, what is important for us? And not just important for you, but what is important to your community? And these are the questions I think we really, really need to ask ourselves as we take this panel on. So I think I'll stop there and leave the rest for everyone else to say.
Thanks, Selena. I think something interesting that you said is that you initially had a development sector background before coming into, you know, more quote-unquote private sector, and that kind of lessons that you brought in from the development sector to the private sector and the kind of thinking. And Prashani, I want to come to you for that, because when we think about multi-stakeholder approaches, and as someone from the development sector, I'm not sure that we think enough about corporations as one of those stakeholders, right? We tend to think of, we think of multilaterals, we think of bilaterals, we think of governments. Perhaps we think of those who sit in the intersection of some of these, but I don't know if we think enough about corporations. And so I wanted to ask you, can you talk to us a little bit about the role that corporations have to play, not just in an approach, in an inclusive approach, but also that intersection of gender equality, financial inclusion, climate finance, particularly. What is the role for corporations in that?
Thanks, Sharanya, and thanks to Commercial Bank for having me. So I think, if you've heard me speaking before, you probably heard me saying this, that the challenges, the sustainability challenges that we face are not something that can be addressed by one party alone, right? It has to be collective action by the private sector, by the NGOs, by the banks, very importantly, as well as the government who sets the national policy framework, right? So without all these parties coming together, it is impossible to drive real change, right? So I'll talk a little bit on inclusion. I'd like to kind of take it to a different dimension with my experience at Haley's, because the strength at Haley's is that we look at inclusion more from an outgrower, smallholder, agriculture, community kind of base, because that is where our businesses are. So I'll take you through a couple of examples where we've really partnered with NGOs as well as our smallholders, our outgrowers, to really drive sustainable change, right? And the important thing here is, I'll come back to Selina and what you started off saying, CSR is not sustainability. 100% agreed, right? And Haley's as a business, we've been around for nearly 150 years for us. CSR is long gone now, right? It has really evolved into sustainability. And yes, we do have shareholders breathing down our neck, but whether they like it or not, now for us, it's a business imperative. And the short time that I have been at Haley's, we have really seen the pressures coming in, particularly from the export markets, right? So I'll just touch on two examples. One is on our rubber producers. So we have Dip Products PLC, which is one of the world's largest rubber glove manufacturers, right? And as you know, Sri Lanka's natural latex production has been on a declining trend, partly due to climate implications, but also other issues with market dynamics, right? So now we have, that is the risk of physical climate risk coming. But on the other hand, we also see the risk of transition risk, because when you say climate change, you also have to think of transition risk. So for Haley's, because we are in every sector, we are seeing these risks somewhere. They hit us somewhere, right? So from the transition side, we are really seeing the customers of Dip Products really pushing down this agenda. I'm sure, Amanti, you experienced this a long time ago, but some of our companies are seeing it now, right? So there is a regulation coming, I'm sure you all have heard about it. It's called the EUDR, EU Deforestation Regulation, where if we want to export to EU, we have to prove that our gloves are not made of rubber that was sourced from land that is deforested, right? So now Dip Products sources rubber from 5,000 rubber farmers, which means you have to go down to that level and be able to get them to do that certification and give the comfort to our customers that this is deforestation free. So how do you do this without partnering your smallholders? You can't, right? You have to build that network. And sometimes if you don't have that relationship with them, they are likely to say, okay, then we don't want to sell to you all. We'll sell to someone else who is not so stringent, right? So this is why building that relationship has really worked for us. So DPL has a long-term program called DPL First Light, where they work with farmers across the island, rubber farmers, in really driving down this sustainability agenda. And that has allowed us to really continue to source locally. Because when you have to import, obviously there are financial implications and it doesn't look good on your P&L. So as a company, DPL has been able to withstand these pressures and really align with the requirements going forward, because we have been able to partner with these smallholder communities, right? Sharanya, you spoke about partnering with NGOs. It's something that we do quite a bit, and there was an interesting example that I like to highlight. So in our plantation sector, we've partnered with an Australian NGO, and they are working, their aim is to bring down the energy consumption and emissions in estate communities where they use stoves, right? So they have this really innovative stove which cuts down emissions by about 30% because it's an efficient mechanism. So we've given them access to our estate communities. They've already done like 30,000 houses in our communities, and their goal is to reach 500,000, right? So these are not things we can do alone, which is why we have to partner with all these different stakeholders. I mean, there are lots of examples that I can provide, but I think those two will kind of shed light as to how important it is to drive collective action. And like Amanti said, I love that word, scalable. It has to be scalable impact, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Prashani. Something you said that was really interesting was about the relationships and the networks, right? And this is true right from the grassroots level, right up onto the multi-stakeholder level, in terms of how we support each other, but also how we share lessons learned and how we share the realities. And something that is particularly interesting also in what you talked about is that there are secting realities that different communities are facing. And subject matter expertise, like you said, so you have NGOs who have a certain subject matter expertise, and you have corporations or, multilaterals or whoever who are able to bring those different expertises to the table. And you talk particularly about estate sector communities who are among some of the most vulnerable to climate change in the country, and perhaps some of the most ignored also because of this. And it's in those communities that are the most vulnerable that, Hasita, I want to come to you to talk a little bit about tools, tools that we talk about, such as community finance mechanisms. We talk about green microfinance. We talk about mobile digital innovations. Prashani touched on some of these innovations, which sound like really sexy, exciting things when we sit on these panels in, glamorous hotels. But what does that really mean for communities who are the most vulnerable to these changes, especially to climate change? What do these tools really mean for them, and what can they do to actually transform the realities they live within?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you Commercial Bank for inviting for this great event. Just before I answer, just would like to a little bit recap and reiterate the fact that that the previous speakers and what Amanti you also said. Because now I think when it's come to, I think all the other panelists also been reiterated this, when it's come to climate adaptation, sustainability and inclusion is a big business case. So then it is where how you create your competitive advantage and how you create competitive differentiation. And I think Amanti was very outspoken on this aspect. So I think when it's come to the climate change, climate financing, climate adaptation and inclusion, we have to keep that in mind. Before I answer, when it's come to the macro level, now I've been coming as economist here. So I think now, at least in Sri Lanka, the most of the macro level initiatives have been now in place. Now, today morning, the Governor of Central Bank just mentioned that Sustainable Financing Roadmap 2.0 has been introduced and launched. And then, very importantly, the new Central Bank Act, which is basically as a result of IMF intervention. That Central Bank Act, what he said is that financial inclusion has been identified by the central bank as one of their mandate. I think that is a very, very important milestone where the regulator and the prominent institute in financial system stability and the financial industry has, by act of their parliament and act of themselves, have been identified the financial inclusion is part of their mandate. I think that's a very, very important, strong act and a strong calling from the regulator side, where then all of us could act upon. Coming back to the other element, when it's come to the macro side, macro level, that we have seen IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, the S1 and S2. The S1 is called about all the sustainability measures, and S2 is for the climate action. And that is where, again, the regulator is pushing the financial institutes on report those things. So now it is very clear, ladies and gentlemen, this climate adaptation, inclusion and all other, it's no longer a CSR initiative, it's part of the business, it is part where everybody now should think and discuss deliberately, open rooms as well as closed board rooms, Amanti, you said, to leverage their sustainability. Coming back to what you said, now when it's come to a company, having this sort of climate adaptation or this inclusion matters, how that important for a company is one thing that, or the institute or the SME or whatever outfit, it's very important thing that we should first put some light on. First one, if you are basically, when it's come to the climate adaptation and climate sort of a resilient approach, it would actually for a company increase their supply chain resilience, because then you know, like, okay, what would be the issues with the environment, and you are ready for the whole the calamity or whole problem that is foreseen to have. So for your supply chain security and for your risk mitigation also, it would be important. So that is where one thing that the companies should work on that, and what is mean to the company. Another very important thing is access to finance. Now, access to finance is two sides. When it's come to a bigger companies and to the banks, and as well as for the SMEs and the small holders. Now, when it's come to access to finance, I think the previous session, Dr. Sugatapal also mentioned, now the climate funds are mandatory. It's not that something, some organization or some philanthropic funds would come as a charity, but climate funds, because it's mandated, because now it's been adopted by the countries and as well as endorsed by the United Nations, there are a lot of climate funds would be available, and then the billions of dollars would be available out there. However, the challenge is that our organizations don't know or don't have sufficient capacity for apply for that and to be compliant, to be eligible for the climate fund. Of course, MS Holding is an outlier, but other than that, because the thing is that according to him, the whole thing is when it comes to reporting requirement of an organization. So most of the Sri Lankan organizations do not have or have less capacity of report these initiatives. Particularly when it's come to data, particularly when it's come to reporting the outputs, outcome and the impact. So I think it is very important that we build that capacity. So if we can build that capacity, and if we can elaborate this or showcase this to the international world, that it would be a quite relatively easier aspect that, or easier way that we can access those funds. I'll come back to the community aspect maybe in a later point. Another one is the resource efficiency and optimization. When it's come to you have adapt the climate change and climate and then that sort of measures, it could increase your resource efficiency, particularly when it's come to the waste management, when it's come to the water systems, and then using of renewable energy and all other aspects. The fourth aspect of that would be that the inclusion, and of course when it's come to climate adaptation, it might lead to your market differentiation, and you could achieve more premium pricing. I think Celine, Celine Enterprise is one of the example that Sri Lanka, that is I think perhaps I just asked from Selina, one of the first and only institution that had that has the fair trade license in Sri Lanka. So in that context, we can use this as a sort of a price differentiation and market differentiation phenomenon, and as well as charge premium pricing. So finally, what I would say for when it's come to the bigger companies, what this inclusion or the climate adaptation means is, it is a systematic way of improving their shareholder wealth, improving their competitiveness. And that is what all of the Sri Lankan corporates and all the banks, financial institutions should do, and then should capitalize at this moment.
Thank you so much, Hasita. I think through what you were saying, a really interesting theme is emerging in this panel, which is a repeated assurance that as you started by saying, Selena, that CSR is not the sustainable way forward, but this is also not about charity. This is not about an act of, being magnanimous and saying, oh, well, look at, all of you who've been left out, we're going to include you. It really makes good business sense, and it is really the only sustainable and sensible way forward at this point in this point in time. Medhini, I'm going to come to you because for those of us who work within the questions of intersections of inclusion and inclusivity, certain things we understand implicitly, but this may not be true for everyone. And somebody listening to an argument that you need to include women and that women are impacted differently might say, well, when the landslide comes or the flood comes, it's not looking to see whether you're a man or a woman, it's sweeping you away. That could be kind of the understanding that we have. But we know that there is an intersection between climate change and gender, and there's a reason we sort of talk about the different impacts it has on different communities. So can you talk to us a little bit about how gender and climate intersect, particularly in the Sri Lankan context, and why we need to have this lens, and why it's important to have that kind of thinking as you create solutions or co-create them?
I think to actually elaborate on the example that you just gave, saying that if there's a landslide, it's not going to see which gender, it's still going to take you away. But given how our society is designed, invariably men are at an advantage, for example, to be able to not just handle shocks, but also have better adaptive strategies. This could boil down to things like access to education, employment, to resources. So that adaptation for women specifically in the society that we have today is like women are already at a disadvantage. But going beyond that example, I think a lot of times, especially in whether it's in the corporate scenario, all of that, we look at climate and gender in different silos, and we look at equity with gender as a completely different issue to climate, whereas it's a highly intersectional issue. So first and foremost, like I mentioned, that gender and also across various different groups within the women, they are affected differently. So we need a lot more gender disaggregated data, which we don't currently have in Sri Lanka. So women experience a lot of these shocks differently, how they adapt is very different. And also even, again, it won't be right to classify women as one group or one sort of community, but within one gender, there's various different levels of access that people have. One example that actually really stands out and is actually very commonly used in this intersection is how in the world, it almost, in terms of water collection, almost in 80% of the cases, the responsibility of securing water for the household falls on the women. And there was a study that was done in a Bangladeshi community, actually, where they noticed that in this community, because women had to go 2 hours away to collect water, invariably the women were consuming a lot less water compared to the male counterparts within their households. This actually led to chronic dehydration, a lot of health issues for the women. So these are sort of issues that we don't always see when we look at climate and gender as two different issues. And as we go along and as climate adaptation needs to become a lot more of a day-to-day activity, we need to start having this gender disaggregated data. I think that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is also a lot more, I think, on the macro level, things like access to finance, for example. Because invariably a lot of this is a lot more available, a lot of these resources, whether it's natural resources, financial resources, because it's available for men a lot more, women are at a disadvantage. So, you need innovative financing mechanisms that goes beyond just, giving loans, giving, savings accounts. And Amanti actually mentioned Seva, so they actually do this one particular adaptive program in India specifically, where as we all know, heat stress is a growing issue, particularly in Sri Lanka as well. So whenever there is a recognition that beyond 2 days, there is going to be a heat wave, automatically a lot of women get financial sort of bursaries for a day, so that they are not stressed about going out for their daily wage income. So these are sort of innovative mechanisms that we also need to look at beyond sort of, looking at just loans and savings, which more often than not is a lot more accessible to only certain sections of the society and not all people as well.
Thank you, Medhini. I think that segues really nicely into what you also were talking about, just making the really business case for it. And I'm wondering now whether it feels a good time to come back to you to talk again more about community financing and the impact on vulnerable communities in that context.
Yeah, thank you. As drawing off what all the other panelists also said, when it's come to the community, so now we have discussed like how it impacts the corporates, but now when it's come to the communities, how the impact of the financial inclusion and the climate financing would help. So one very important point is that it's all about that your accessibility. And then now we have almost, developed digital tools now when it's come to the digital literacy and all other. And then when it's come to when it's come to applying for financial resources or financial or loans or any savings or insurance product, that you don't have not necessarily to to visit and go for the bank or financial company. So that is one of the very important thing where these communities can at their doorstep get this facility and then get whatever they want and then get served. So which is, I think, one of the very important thing. Another one, it's a very important other research that has been, I think, in the morning also shown when it's come to particularly the women-headed household. The vulnerability and the impact of women-headed household in terms of the over-indebtedness is comparatively higher than the average. Because so that means women and women-headed household are much more vulnerable for over-indebtedness due to whatever reason. And then other one is when it's come to the climate-related situations, climate-related adaptation, the vulnerability again when it's come to women-headed household, it's high. So I think one of the other good element of being inclusive finance and access to these financial resources for women-headed household would be that it would lead to minimize that. And as we know, empowering women and providing them with the strength and the ability to maneuver with household activities would generally not only empower them, empower the entire family, right? So that is the second aspect. And other one, when it's come to the community-based risk pooling, it's also very important because that is again that we have seen, because Sri Lanka is now increasingly moving towards a country which is of high calamities of climate change or highly impacted by climate change. And then we can see that, I mean, every other month we can hear about either a drought or a flood or anything like that. So have this sort of financing possibilities at the doorsteps, particularly to the vulnerable communities, will limit their vulnerability in that sense. So they would know, like, I mean, when it's come to like insurance or any products which is basically based and identified and factors those things into their financial aspects would be really good. So those are the ways that the household level or the community level that can be benefited out of these sort of activities.
Thank you for that. Selena, I'm coming to you now because as we talk about communities, you've had some really interesting experience of what it means to respond directly to community needs. So you have a pilot works great in one community, you talk about it, and then you go to another community and it doesn't work. And what does it mean to work in tandem with communities and be adaptable when you really hear what their needs are?
Thanks, Sharanya, for that. So I'll tell you a little story, and my intention of saying that is to share with you the mindset of how you create, innovate, move from pilot to scale and real sustainability, and how and why community has to be part of it. So you all know we are in the textile space, and during COVID, of course, all our factories were shut, retail shops were shut for nearly 6 months. And we also realized at that time that women in our communities didn't have menstrual products, and they were going back to cloth. And currently in Sri Lanka, there's about 2.8 million women who are living in this manner in period poverty. So we didn't know that then, but we thought, we are just solving a problem for our community. Let's just use the textile in our stores to make pads. You think it's very simple, right? Putting some cloth together, making pads. But I think the learning, and I think coming to what we started in 2020 and now coming to 2025, where we've actually taken that philanthropic effort into a business at this moment. We have just launched Celine's new subsidiary called FemCare, which is moving from handlooms to producing menstrual products, not only in textile, but also in rubber. I mean, how did that journey come? And that was completely listening to the needs of the community. So starting from, let's just give a cloth pad, to donating it and then understanding, actually, you can't do this without giving them the knowledge on menstrual hygiene and menstrual education. And then does Celine go to try to do that? No. That's where the partnership comes in. That's where ARCA initiative came in to really start distributing these pads responsibly. And I mean, to cut a long story short, we started with multicolor pads, and then the community said that they felt, one community, a couple of them said, you could see the stain, so can you give us something black? So then the next batch was black, and then the health community said, no, you can't give black because you actually need to see the stain. So now it's the color of the stain. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that product, process, profit. I mean, I'm going to be running a company that's going to sell menstrual products across the world. And I think that's quite lucrative if you do any kind of numbers at this moment, right? But the philosophy behind that is listening, learning, and then adapting. At every point, I mean, just yesterday I was sitting with my team to develop a newer version which was cheaper, and we had to go out of our way. If you add a piece there, yes, it looks good, but then it's going to be too expensive, profit. But if you remove it, what about people? If you add another layer of a polyurethane layer, what about planet? And if it's easy, you're probably not doing the right thing. I think that's just the simple mantra that I go by. Like, if you're not going out of your way, then it's probably not sustainable, right? So, I mean, it's a wonderful journey, I think, to live this, to be able to lead a company that through its efforts are really not just creating now a product for women, but a product that can kind of mitigate the huge climate impact that comes out of using disposable menstrual products. So just in Sri Lanka, there's some crazy number, like 963 million single-use pads that are used a year. I mean, that's something like 669 20-foot containers that enter our landfill. Again, an example how, I'm a medium-scale business for all intents and purposes and by numbers, right? But as business, if we can take those steps to solve problems, not only are you looking at people, you're definitely creating solutions for planet, and there's definitely going to be some profit somewhere there, right? So that, I think, answers the question, Shara.
Very much so. Very much so. Prashani, I'm coming back to you because Selena talked about supply chains. And we know in agricultural supply chains, there is quite an impact that climate change is absolutely having. I mean, it's just the reality of it. So can you talk to us a little bit about strategies in building resilience, especially for climate change in agriculture, given the huge numbers that agriculture employs in this country, and the very pressing reality of how much it impacts people just at a numbers game?
Yeah, so I'll kind of talk about this both in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, because we are trying to do both. And again, I think out of all our sectors, the one that is most exposed to climate risk at this point is the plantation sector. So we have 3 regional plantation companies, which are Thalawakale, Kalani Valley, and Horana plantations. We cultivate over 15,000 hectares collectively one of the largest plantation groups in the country, right? So it's really interesting to see how climate change implications have intensified. I know we always say this, oh my God, the wet days are getting wetter and the dry days are getting drier, but it's actually a reality that we see every day. So when we were visiting the plantations, I think about last year, there was this one estate guy who was telling me, for the first time ever we had to water, because I mean, they are traditionally rain-fed, right? But because of the droughts, they had to water. So these are the material differences that we are seeing. And you spoke about the implications, so definitely we see changes in quality. We see significant variations in yield and crop, which makes it very difficult to plan. So our head of plantations, he always goes to the board and says, you know, but the rain is beyond my control. And it's true. I mean, the board doesn't understand this, but it is true. So there's now a lot of elements that we can't control. So in the plantations, like I said, we are looking at adaptation and mitigation together. So on the mitigation side, all three of our companies have committed to science-based targets. 2 of them have got their targets verified. Talawakale was the first plantation company in the world to get its targets verified by SBTi. So all 3 companies collectively, we have about 70 to 80% reliance on renewable energy. So it is something that we are driving quite strategically, right? But I think now the focus is really more on climate adaptation. What are we going to do? Because all these things are beyond our control. Because yes, mitigation is real, but at the end of the day, Sri Lanka's carbon footprint is less than 1% of the world's carbon footprint. So for Sri Lanka, the priority should be on how we adapt, right? So for us, regenerative agriculture, I think this term came up earlier, but it's something that we are trying to pursue. Again, quite easy to talk about these things, but it's very challenging to do. Especially when you are dealing with communities. We have 15,000 estate workers who kind of don't want to change the way they work as well, right? So we are looking at protecting soil, biodiversity covers, water bodies, preserving the water bodies. So these are all like environmental angles that we are looking at. And just to circle back to the fact that it has made business sense for us, right? For example, all our companies were really pursuing organic fertilizer in a big way. And because of this, they were, I'm not saying they were not affected, but they were a little bit less affected when the fertilizer ban happened, right? Because they were ready, they were resilient, right? And still to date, all 3 of our companies are consistently number 1, 2, 3 price takers at the Colombo tea auction because they built that name for quality, and that brand has actually been built around sustainability. And when I see how they work and the effort that they put in, it is something that is very real to them because it's the challenge they face day in, day out, right? So that's how for us really looking at climate resilience in a strategic way has made business sense. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting because it's, I mean, we use the word resilience in different contexts, but particularly in this context, it's also about being adaptable. And then if you're inclusive, you are almost naturally adaptable because you've been thinking from different angles from the get-go. Amanti, we haven't forgotten about you, as you've been chilling there in the corner. And I wanted to ask you about corporate initiatives, particularly in the context of, you know, we struggle, especially those of us who are children of the 90s, remember the pick up your trash and don't use plastic straws, and the sort of individualization of the idea of, before it was even called sustainability, right? And that somehow it was about an individual choice. It was individual choices. And now as we've evolved in our thinking, we understand that it's also systemic, right? That it's not solvable just because we stop using plastic straws, and sometimes that doesn't really work for, you know, inclusion in context of disability and all these things. So I wanted to ask you, you know, when we talk about corporate initiatives, how do they bridge this gap, you know, between systemic solutions, but also not forgetting about individual systemic, or rather individual societal responsibility?
Sure. I think that's a really nice question, and I was really happy to sit here. I think everyone's heard me speak enough, but So here's the thing about individual choices and systemic, right? At the end of the day, everything is moved by humans, right? Whoever's making the decisions in the boardroom, if you are a convinced student who really thought about sustainability, if you really liked wildlife, all of that adds up and makes a difference. And if you see the 2 case stories and the 2 videos we showed, it always starts by being personal. Any systemic change, anything we want to bring into the boardroom, you have to affect people at their own level, right? When we speak to sewing machine operators on plastic and single-use plastic usage, the first thing we spoke of is not about the, the leatherback turtle who's having, plastic in their system. We spoke about plastic in mother's milk. So you have to understand where someone is coming from, their viewpoint, and that's why the individual journey is as important, and I'll still stand by it. Yes, we want to make systemic change, but it's the Sanods and the Rasmilas who will be the AG's officer, will be the, somebody who's leading something, maybe a head of a bank, even the head of the, the three-wheeler association. All of them play a role. So it's very important that we bring education to the forefront. And I'm sure everyone has heard it, but at every level in which you operate, have people bringing in different thinking and educate and move on. Something that worked yesterday isn't working today. Let's talk about it. Let's say, yes, this was what I did. This was what, we speak about things like, the amount of sugar we had or the carbonated drinks we had in the 90s, right? None of us should be living, right? But we are. And we are the same parents who are now banning it for our children. If we can make those systemic changes from what's served in canteens to the way we deal with people, the terminologies we use to be inclusive, we can definitely make those systemic changes, and that bridging can easily be done, and like you said, by the private sector, because we are really great at bringing new change, right? The latest technology, we are adopting. Is it data analytics we need? It was needed yesterday, and it's with us today. So in the same manner, the changes that we need to make in communities, we are in a super place to affect that thinking, because we have a workforce that comes and then they see certain things. Then they carry that back to their communities, to their families. They have difficult conversations. They affect the thinking. So I think there is a huge responsibility to take every one of these programs that we do within our factories, within our corporates. Commercial bank, this morning they explained how they have this, no printing policy. Right? Maybe we need to kind of spread that around and bring it into their families and how they resonate with unnecessary printing. So then you've really affected the thinking.
Thank you for that, Amanti. We're just about to open up for questions from the audience, but I just have one quick one for you, Medhani, before we open it up. We haven't really talked about the importance of national adaptation plans and then the role they play in addressing not just gender-specific climate vulnerabilities, but in general, because that is what sets the tone at the state level, but also is something that can then penetrate down to other stakeholders. So can you talk us through that just very briefly?
So currently Sri Lanka, so the national adaptation plan that we currently have was put out in 2016 for a period of 10 years. So that ended in 2025. And that was a very macro level national adaptation plan. And in terms of, given that we are talking about inclusivity and equity, so I think just very briefly, the target beneficiaries are not as equitable as it needs to be, particularly in this national adaptation plan. Even though the priority areas that are identified are, things like agriculture, fisheries, even infrastructure, for example, a lot of this is where a lot of different communities are at the forefront, a lot of women are in the forefront, but at the same time, there isn't enough gender sensitivity that's brought in. Yes, there's inclusivity in terms of, for example, estate workers being given priority and things like that, but it isn't equitable to a point where you can say, okay, all sort of marginalized communities within Sri Lanka are taken into consideration. But having said that, the 2025 National Adaptation Plan is going to be more specifically for the provincial level, which is where a lot of this equity and inclusivity is a lot more crucial. And that is, I think, going to come out towards the end of the year. But also in 2023, what is good though is that in the NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions, which is in line with the Paris Agreement, Sri Lanka has identified that a lot of the implementation needs to be inclusive for marginalized communities, but also specifically for gender, which is good because that is promising that it is going in the right direction. But in terms of adaptation itself, I think what is really important to keep in mind is, especially to have inclusive adaptation plans, is one, to be able to recognize the different needs and capacities of these groups. We spoke a lot about the needs on the panel so far, but what we also have to recognize is the different capacities. And more often than not, we ignore what certain marginalized groups can bring to the table, because a lot of them are in the forefront of managing a lot of these natural resources and ecosystems. And again, more often than not, it's a lot of women who are actually in the forefront within these communities. So we need to recognize and understand what the different needs as well as capacities are. We also need to provide equitable access to resources and finances across the board for all marginalized communities, for all women, gender-based. But at the same time, there needs to be equitable access to decision-making, which then would bring us down to having public consultations, but equitable public consultations where everyone is also included. Because end of the day, these adaptation plans, like you said, sets the tone for what happens in the country.
Thank you. That I think segues beautifully and kind of sums up. We come back again to the importance of inclusion and how much it penetrates across. I think we have space for a couple of questions/interventions from the audience. If you raise your hand, we can get a mic across to you. And there's a gentleman in the back. I think we can take two before, if there's a need to respond. There's someone over there at the back who raised his hand.
Hi everyone, my name is Shivan, and Commercial Bank, you have done a lovely job at organizing this, especially with beautiful women who's very resourceful. I know Amanti, I think you started this sustainable journey with Eco Go Beyond, Women's Go Beyond 20 years ago, right? Met you there, and well done. And also Celine, it takes immense pleasure when a foreigner talks about Sri Lankan products that have tremendous value. And I visited this embassy, and this foreign gentleman actually called and told me about the fair trade certified fabrics in their sofas and stuff by selling. So that's wonderful. So Mike, I have just two questions. The first question is, how do you find ways of finding problems, and the environmental, the solutions, how do you, like, especially in your menstrual pads, for example, how do you find solutions for supply chain, take it down to the retail level, because I'm sure there would be challenges, and that is something that entrepreneurs would like to know. And the second question is for you, ma'am, and that's how do you get this data across to the ministries? Because I'm sure I deal with ministries quite a lot, and some of the issues or challenges they face is that when we get grants, funding, climate financing, they don't have sufficient data to build reports to actually build community solutions. So we can talk forever, but it should go to the community. So the two questions is on supply chain and also on how the data can actually cascade towards decision making.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have another question? Because I think we can take one more question. There's someone in the back just behind there.
Hi, I'm Kanishka. I'm from IOM. So just a statement to start with. Thank you for the forum, for organizing such a wonderful forum. And also, we speak of inclusivity, but looking at the way today's program has gone. So I've noticed this quite often. Whenever we speak about inclusivity, we have a lot of women in the front. We have a lot of women leading the discussion. But when it comes to more technically driven panels, we still tend to keep the women, maybe it's not intentional, but I'm sure we have experts in those areas that you can find a place for a woman, a seat on the panel, right? So my question is, in your individual corporates, now I think you consult the communities before when you do a needs assessment as to what the community needs. I want to know how, for example, Haley's do a lot of work in the agribusiness. So how well do you incorporate a woman's opinion when you do a needs assessment? Do you do community consultations? And also, even though at the ground level you might be incorporating women, if the scenario is similar to these conferences set up, how many women in your boardrooms make decisions together with the men in the boardrooms? You know, like how institutionalized is your inclusivity in your own corporates? I mean, it's not an attack. I just want to know, because I've been trying to read this situation for a long time when, I mean, in the UN setup, it's very inclusive because we have a lot of women. But when you move towards these private sectors, it's not that we don't have women that are smart. We do, right? I think I'm a smart woman, but you don't see women like in the previous panel I was in, it was just men. It was quite boring also. And the other sectors also, I think, very less women involved. So why do you think that is? I mean, it's a bit strange, don't you think?
Thank you so much for that question. Interestingly, it's a conversation this panel had just before we got up on stage about, you know, how inclusion tends to be one panel discussion and not necessarily mainstreamed across the entire design of conferences and how we think of the whole thing as a whole. So thank you for that question. So we're going to go Selena, then we're going to go Prashani, and then Amanti, I'm going to let you take the question on institutionalizing actual decision making and not just women as tokens. So we'll start here and then cross it go.
I think in the interest of time, I'll keep it very short. Thank you for that comment. We've been wondering the same thing for a very long time. Hopefully it changes with us in leadership at some point. On the supply chain question, I think, I mean, as every business, it's just a business decision to deal with supply chains, right? So I think long story short, you have to adopt the same kind of principles, tactics, techniques in order to create your supply chain that works for you. But what I'd like to say is, rather than focusing on supply chain, especially as we go ahead as a country, I think we need to focus on value chains. So how can large enterprises work with medium-scale enterprises work with small, micro, and then where does the development sector, the NGOs fit in? And then together as a whole, how do you take on region and then globe? I think that's kind of the thinking that a smarter business person would be taking at this moment. And the rest we deal with as every business does, but of course in an equitable manner. But yeah, just working together, I think the partnerships aspect is not looked at enough. And that's something we need to take quite seriously, especially as a small country. I think that's perhaps our only competitive advantage as a country.
Amazing. Thank you, Selena. Prashant.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'll quickly address your issue on how the data is cascaded up. So at the moment, it's primarily through industry forums, and most of our sectors are very active, say in the Planters Association or in export boards, that sort of thing. But I do agree there is a lack of national data, right? But on climate, and I think as you mentioned this, the new SLFRS S1 and S2 standards become mandatory next year for the top 100 listed companies. And at the end, the final goal of it is to quantify the impacts of sustainability on your financials, right? So when all our companies start adapting this, so by 2030, I think bulk of the companies will have to start reporting on S1 and S2, then we will have a good national database as to how climate really impacts. So it will take some time to get there, but I think that is probably the most positive outcome right now. I don't see any other platform where everyone will report holistically on these numbers, right? I'd also quickly touch on the question that you raised. So at Haley's, 35% female representation overall, 12% at management level, right? So it's a journey, it's a challenge, we have to keep pushing. And for those of you all in the room, we have one lady in a board which has 12 other men. And it's taken 150 years to get there, right? So it's a challenge, but I think small steps. So last year we pushed and we got paternity leave. I actually wanted to call the program Baby Steps, like literally baby steps. But these are things that I think, like Selena, you said, hopefully when we are in leadership, these are changes that can be done. And I think for the next generation, the future is looking brighter.
Absolutely. Very quickly to you, Amanti.
So to very quickly close out, I think that's a great question. But you know, inclusion is evolving. When I sit here and speak on inclusion, I always think, how come there isn't a person with disabilities? And how come that's not disturbing anybody in the audience, right? We've got so long and taken so long to come to this point where people will be like, how come there aren't women in the panel before? But there are so many underrepresented areas, and this has been continuous work. When you talk about people ending up in management, again, Prashant, to your numbers, we have about 70% women, and we have 24 in the boardroom, right? I mean, sorry, not even boardroom, management caliber, women in management. How does this work? By actually looking at your pipelines, right? Doing unconscious bias. There's a lot of groundwork to be done to make people come to the table, and then who ends up in the board is meritocracy based. The right voice has to end up there to take the decisions, but to make sure there are people in the pipeline, bringing them through the recruitment paths, looking at internal and external issues. We are talking about a care economy where the homework and looking after the elderly is on women. We're looking at persons with disabilities who just don't get to study. There's certainly like science subjects, etc. you cannot do. You will do a fine arts degree, and that's why we will have persons with disabilities working for us at the lower level, but nobody in management or in tech. And again, for women, the reason that many of this is in a state is simply because we've studied something. Most of us are in support areas, HR, legal, etc., because that's what we've done 20 years ago. That's what we were driven to do, and now we are old enough to be in the board, right? Why is there a war happening all over? Because there's, 3 old uncles who really loved the war stories. So this is all repercussions that we have to change. And the changes start with baby steps, where you change the status quo now, you change education for children, you create unconscious bias inside your boardrooms and your decision making, and then the numbers will work.
Thank you very
Sharanya,
much.
if I may,
yeah,
sorry.
Please.
I just want to quickly add some data and some facts on, so far we spoke about why there needs to be women representation, but I can't let this opportunity go as a researcher without actually bringing forward some facts. So in 2023, the IFC actually released a report on how women representation within corporate scenarios can actually bring a lot of tangible results, particularly with climate-related aspects. So in the report, it basically said that when firms have at least 30% women board members, they outperformed their peers on climate policy as well as transparency. That's one. And one interesting example, because also we're in a panel, or rather in an event today where there's a lot of technical aspects that's being discussed, where there are a lot of men and not a lot of women. There was one study that was carried out with 2,000 companies in 24 industrialized economies. So it's not a small study. And this was carried out between 2009 and 2019. And they found that 1% increase in the proportion of female managers correlated to 0.5% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions. So there are tangible decarbonization results if you do have more women representation. So I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind, that it's not just about equity, but it's also about what results you get by the end of it.
And what we've kept saying this entire panel is that it's good business sense. It's not charitable, it's not magnanimous, it's not the right thing. It is literally the right thing to do in every aspect. Thank you very much to my phenomenal panelists. May you all continue to go forth and create good trouble and disrupt systems and rebuild and reimagine systems as you have been doing so far, and inspire others in the audience and beyond to continue doing the same. Back to ComBank.
Thank you.